Chapter 21 of In Quest of El Dorado by Stephen Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, Goodbye to the Horses. Returning from Grand Canyon, we discussed plans for the coming year. Ewart had his Scots Guard history, which he ought to finish by the summer, and then he was going north to the Canadian line and proposed to make a study of the relationship of the two peoples, Canadian and American, for a book called The Unguarded Line. I had in mind to go to Mexico, continuing this study of the quest of El Dorado along the traces of Cortez's conquest. The severity of the Santa Fe winter decided Ewart against staying there any longer, and he yearned to go with me to Mexico. Against the latter, I dissuaded him. He had the weight of the history on his mind as something which must be done, must be got over, for he had contracted to do it. He said he would take the history with him and do it there. But I felt Mexico too unsafe a place for him to be in by himself. He did not know any Spanish, and therefore would be taken for a gringo and treated accordingly by a people who had the reputation of being extremely disobliging. Ewart, however, was about equally drawn to New Orleans, which for long had been a city of romance to him, a place he certainly wanted to know. There he could live very well till the spring, and then, if he wished, return to Santa Fe. We would all return to Santa Fe in the spring and have some last gallops over the desert before the summer. Ewart decided to go to New Orleans. The immediate problem was the bestowal of our horses. Ewart referred the matter to Cowboy Pete, a near neighbor, asking him if he would like the use of a horse for the rest of the winter, or if he would like to buy a horse. The cowboy was abusive and amusing. "Do I want your pony? I tell yer the only way I'd take that thar broomtail of your'n would be with a $20 bill tied around his neck. Best thing you can do is put a brand on him and then take him up in the mountains and leave him there. Turn him loose, I tell yer. Then if you come back in the spring and find him, why, you've got a horse, see? But if not, why, you've saved the price of his feed. If he's a sturdy pony, he'll last out the winter all right. But I tell you, right now, I can buy ponies like that of your'n by the carload at $5 apiece just now. No one has any use for ponies in the winter. Costs more than they're worth in feed. Tell yer straight, I wouldn't give him hell room on the ranch. But put a brand on him, a new brand, and take him up in the mountains." Cowboy Pete spoke very loudly, evidently under the impression that Ewart was deaf, for the Englishman had a habit of asking questions twice. I stood by and interpreted the one to the other. Ewart, however, did not trust to the idea of abandoning George among the snows, though it is a customary way of keeping horses in the winter in New Mexico. He had paid $25 for him, and he thought he ought eventually to get some of it back. He therefore sedulously sought buyers. At length he struck up a deal with a Mexican hauler of wood. George was to be delivered up for $12.50. "If only you could have been there," said Ewart afterwards. "I led old George down the street and was about to hand him over when the Mexican's brother came flying out of a college and started to abuse George in Spanish, finding every imaginable fault in him. I said he had carried the poet hundreds of miles without misadventure before I bought him, but other Mexicans joined in the dispute, and I was obliged to let George go for 10. The last I saw of him, he was hauling wood on Palace Avenue." My wife and I had become more attached to our horses, having had them longer and done more on them, and the idea of parting with them made us very sad. Only on the very last night did I part with Billy, and Buck went a day or so before. We found good homes for both of them, and I believe the happy life they had with us continues still as friends bestride them. Just before Christmas, we then parted from Santa Fe, Ewart some days ahead of us for New Orleans, and we for Mexico City. We expected to meet in the spring or summer in the States once more, and little imagined as we said goodbye that we should be reunited at the end of the year, and then separated, as it were, forever. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of In Quest of El Dorado by Stephen Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, The Gold. Mexico is a country marked for conquest. It is no doubt the most romantic country of the New World, but its history has been the most sordid. It is gilded with tales of fortune and wonder. Even its sunsets must seem of a more marvelous coloring than those of other shores. It has been and is a land of riches, and it has for that reason attracted the violence of mankind. Even before the Spaniards came, Mexico lived in a state of war. Empire had succeeded empire. The crushing of the Aztecs by Cortes was not a surprise to the Indians. They fully expected some new race to come out of the horizon and destroy them, as they themselves had destroyed others. The difference between warfare with the Spaniard and warfare before the Spaniards came was that the former was more racial and less covetous. Certainly, there never had been a people with such a craving for gold as the bearded men of Cortes. Their passion for it was cited by the Aztecs as a reason for disbelieving in their supposed divine origin. They could do without women, but they could not go without gold. Though they seemed able to command the lightning, were they not slaves of the yellow metal? Gold, as presents, they took greedily. When presents ceased, they took it by demand, and then by robbery. They tortured Indians to learn secrets of hidden treasure, burned noble enemies alive. They fought with one another. Their love of it was stronger than their loyalty to one another. When they had got it, they hid it for fear of being dispossessed of it, and when they had hidden it, they lost it. And then others sought for it and fought for it. Gold was most freely mingled with Spanish blood. The story of the quest for the gold is of the primitive kind that belongs not so much to economics and politics as to the child's picture novel. No doubt it can still cause a thrill in the pirate blood of many a grown man, but the interest is now gloriously fictional. Mexico is still a land of gold, but you no longer go there like Ali Baba or Qasim with sacks. Now, somewhere or other, you have to get that prized oro over a bank counter. There is no great difference in the result, except that you may get more gold and lose less blood than in the old days. But, oh, the difference in the manner and in the style of getting it. It seems incongruous to think of the mining enterprises, oil concessions, and trading concerns of today as carrying on the tradition of the conquistadores of Spain. Nevertheless, it is so. There are armies and navies behind the trade, and there is policy correlating the significance of the whole. One of the most profitable wars in history was that of 1848, by which the United States obtained the greater part of her mineral wealth of today, the gold of California, the silver of Nevada, the copper of Arizona. It is true that had these vast territories remained in the control of the Mexican people, they would not have been exploited to the extent that they are now. The new, stirring civilization of California could hardly have sprung into existence. Under Mexican rule, there would have been no new Western universities, but no doubt there would have been new battlefields instead. On the other hand, if the United States had taken over the vast metalliferous state of Chihuahua as well, what wealth would be coming forth of it now? Instead of wealth starting from the state of Chihuahua, revolutions start from there. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that the wealth-seeking population of the United States should feel some urge to change the political turbulence into productive peace. The whole of Mexico is a great treasure cave for those who know the words which open the door. The Mexicans clearly do not know, or they have forgotten, the word. Instead of saying, "Open sesame," they say, "Open blood vessels," or some such impolite cacophony. They say very loudly, "Make the foreigner pay," and things of that sort, but it does not open the door. President Obregón has said, rather pathetically, that Mexico is capable of sustaining a population of 100 millions instead of the poverty-stricken 15 millions which now inhabit it. And he has pointed out the paradox that the richest country in the world has the poorest people. Mexico and Russia are somewhat alike in this respect. In both cases, the lands are marvelously rich and the people incredibly poor. But if they wish to be rich, there is only one way, and that is to find the means of unlocking the potential treasures of the land. To the Anglo-Saxon, that seems a simple matter. Quit fighting, begin working, cultivate honesty, educate the illiterate, enforce the laws. But to the Mexican, that seems to be psychologically impossible. I believe that in time the United States will finish her conquest of Mexico. The conquest is being now furthered by peaceful penetration and partially thwarted by a revolutionary government and by the powerful character of General Obregón. Whether the conquest will be consummated ultimately by force of arms depends largely on the behavior of the politicians and generals fighting amongst themselves. The speculative mind may pause on the thought of the material grandeur of the United States when it gets Mexico fairly going. The gold of the world is largely massed at Washington even now. The rich people of the world are the Americans. America is the greatest organized unity of peoples and unity of resources. She is already capable of initiating, if she wished, a world policy which no other nation dare dream of. But with the realization of the Mexican Ophir, there will no longer be any quest for El Dorado. El Dorado will be discovered and identified. El Dorado will be the North American continent from Panama to the unguarded line. El Dorado will be America. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of In Quest of El Dorado by Stephen Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23, Approaching Mexico from the North. It came as a pleasant surprise upon entering Mexican territory to receive gold coins in exchange for paper money. Mexico, since 1920, has had a gold and silver currency and no banknotes. All the depreciated paper has been withdrawn from circulation, and there is that much wealth in the Estados Unidos Mexicanos which obtains in no European country today a stability of the value of money. One certainly feels as if one had in one's possession something real with a pocket full of handsome gold pieces. The bright silver peso is rather heavy in the pocket, it is true, but one does not soon tire of looking at the coinage and rejoicing in it. When one has traveled round Europe with locally printed francs and wads of worthless crowns and marks, and even in the United States with its many shredded and grease-stricken $1 bills, one feels a due astonishment that Mexico, in one respect, is showing the world its way. Unfortunately, however, the new Bank of Issue is to begin printing banknotes again very soon. The 10-peso piece with Independencia y Libertad cut into the unmilled edge reminds of the Russian 10-ruble bits. But the Mexican 20 pesos, worth 2 guineas or $10, is a beautiful and distinctive gold piece with its impress of the elaborate and detailed calendar stone of the Aztecs. Mexico has triumphed over the currency trouble, but like Europe and the United States, she still has the passport disease, requiring photographs and fees before you enter the land. The United States, however, has exerted her power and influence to remove this obstruction as far as her own nationals are concerned. American citizens go back and forth at will without show of visa. The British Foreign Office could achieve the same results, but is, I am told, too idle. It may seem a small matter to those who do not travel, but it is an undoubted convenience. The sudden demand for photographs often delays the British traveler 24 hours at El Paso or Laredo, and he naturally asks himself why he should pay 10 shillings while his American neighbor gets in free. For us, these matters were arranged at El Paso. Here my wife and I spent a few days, met Duncan Aikman working on the El Paso Times, and with his hospitable assistance we viewed the frontier city. I learned from him that Wilfred Ewart had broken his journey to New Orleans at this point and had decided to take a 10-day trip into Mexico. The tickets of the Southern Pacific Railroad give travelers special facilities for doing that. It enables Americans to get a drink if they wish. Ewart, I found, had bought a round-trip ticket to take him to Mexico City and then back to Texas by a different route, by San Luis Potosí and Laredo. I at once felt some apprehension for my friend. "I do hope he comes to no harm," I exclaimed. "He'll be all right," said Aikman. "I have given him an introduction to the governor of Chihuahua, General Enriquez. Mexico has become much quieter." I was much struck by the contrast between El Paso and the Spanish city opposite it. El Paso grows and spreads on the desert like some super cactus barbed with every barb of civilization. It is amazing in its artificiality, its unwantedness. I have been in frontier cities between the Turkestan Desert and Mongolia, low, squalid, utterly unblessed by God or man, but El Paso on the Mexican line is nothing like them. The sidewalks of New York and Chicago are continued here. The line of their housetops against the Texas sky barely attenuates. But opposite El Paso, on the southern side of the Rio Grande, is El Paso's opposite, La Ciudad de Juarez. There is only a bridge between, a mere 30 or 40 yards of wood and iron, Mexico on one side, America the other. Mexican squalor on one hand, American civilization in full blast on the other. The 3 minutes transition as you walk across the muddy Rio is surely one of the most surprising in the New World. The road is level, but you step down as into an abyss. In the United States city is every sign of wealth and self-respect, of militant commerce and the rewards and aims of trade. Schools, theaters, churches vie with one another to raise the population and magnify the name of the city and the fame of America. The newspapers cry the news of the day, and the El Paso Times seems no whit less vigorous or informed than the Tribune of Chicago itself. The hotels of El Paso, the luxurious Paso del Norte, the commodious Sheldon, are grandiose in charge and style. No drummer from another city needs to walk along a corridor for his bath. And as for restaurants, there seems to be a sort of special El Paso chic. They infallibly bring you finger bowls, and no El Pasoan drinks from one by mistake. But without a jest, one fares better and is treated with more dignity in an El Paso café than in New York. The air of El Paso is pure, the roads are clean, there are no hobos sitting in the little park where its alligators live under the fountain. The businessmen wear iron clothes, their gait is dignified and steady, except perhaps when coming from the direction of the Juarez Bridge. What more can one say? El Paso is real, genuine United States. And the fort above it, with its barracks and soldiers, worships the stars and stripes no more than does the business world below. But walk across that little bridge, and the vision is gone. You have more effectually left Uncle Sam than if you had spent a week on the Atlantic doing so. You are in Europe. You have left the banner of Kansas behind and are with the publicans and sinners once again. Loungers, beggars, drunken men, saloons, gambling houses, dust and stink, moldering mud houses, and poor wooden cabins give the first impression of Mexico in the north. Directly you cross the bridge, the beggars, as in Spain itself, are whining and extending arms. Of course, as one goes further, there is a cathedral and a bullring, and there are some large American shops. An American trolley car comes out of El Paso, crosses that bridge, circles through Juarez like a figure skater, and goes out again into America by another bridge, and the steel lines hypnotize one to follow back to the comfortable states. The city of Juarez has, however, a bad name which is somewhat exaggerated. Vice, by repute, is generally magnified. Juarez and the other gate city of Old Laredo are both called the Monte Carlo of Mexico. There are columns in the press devoted to tales of their wickedness. There is said to be a large sale of cocaine and opium, and that many young people are under the influence of these drugs. As for alcoholic drink, there is no question but that in Juarez excessive quantities are taken. There has been much bootlegging on a large and petty scale. So many night excursions by aeroplane have been made by Americans that the Mexican government has equipped an aerial fleet to police the frontier. Government prohibition agents of the United States have recommended that Mexico be asked to consent to the establishment of a dry zone all along the border. President Obregón, when asked about this, said Mexico would welcome the establishment of such a zone, as he felt it humiliating that Americans, unable to satisfy their vicious cravings in America, should come to Mexico to do so. This, however, Obregón probably did not mean to be taken seriously. Like many other Mexican politicians, he loves making witty remarks at the expense of America. In connection with the American idea of control of the border may be mentioned the resolution adopted by the House of Representatives of the Legislature of Arizona requesting the President of the United States to start negotiations for the purchase, lease, or joint control of 200 miles of the said border. But that is not so much to further prohibition as to further trade, the people of Arizona seeking an outlet, a sort of Salonika on the Gulf of California. They would like the frontier of Arizona to run due west from the town of Nogales to the sea. Nogales is going to be an important point in the approach to Mexico from the north. There is a railway which was wrecked during the Revolutionary period. It ran between the Sierra Madre and the ocean, and was the only railroad development of the Gulf of California and the Pacific coast for 1,000 miles. It was not finished, but now, I believe, the Southern Pacific Company, which possesses the franchise, have been enabled to repair the damage and will soon run a service of trains from Arizona and California to Guadalajara. It should be said that Californians have naturally a much deeper interest in the American development of Mexico than most states. Financial groups have lately taken over large tracts of land near Tehuantepec and also in the state of Veracruz. California has as vigorous an attitude toward Mexico on the western side as Texas has on the east. California's destiny seems to hold the commercial domination of the Pacific coast. There is another grand railroad project on foot, the Gran Ferrocarril Panamericano, which is to join New York with the Canal Zone of Panama by a permanent way through Mexico, Guatemala, and so forth. The establishment of this Pan-American Railway depends, however, more upon the Central American republics than on Mexico. 1,000 miles of this road remains to be built over land, much subject to earthquakes and revolutions. But the through carriages now running from Chicago to Mexican City via Laredo are a symptom of closer railroad connections. I did not, however, enter by Laredo or Nogales, but by El Paso. The distance to Mexico City is nearly 2,000 kilometers, mostly of sand and piñon trees. The Santa Fe country seems to extend endlessly southward. Desert dust enters the train and almost stifles you. From the window of the railway carriage, you see the yucca's withered stem and the dead cactus extend to you a dusty hand, welcoming you to no man's land. The contours of the mountains are, as in New Mexico, wind-worked, wind-shaped, and there are great rounded hats of rock, gray and sun-wasted. Occasionally one comes to wretched mud-built villages whose whole population turns out in rags to sell coffee and chili sandwiches to passengers at the halting places. 300 miles south of El Paso, the wilderness is broken by Chihuahua, of which Cunningham Graham used to write, fondly pronounced Chihuahua in London, but locally Chihuahua. I broke my journey in this city and enjoyed the refreshment of spirit which comes when you suddenly escape from winter and change one country grown familiar for one which is unfamiliar. Chihuahua, capital of one of the United States of Mexico, is a fine city, or the ruins of one. Not so deep as Pompeii, yet it lies well under the dirt. War and revolution have battered it. Mud has swept over its streetcar lines. Economically, it seems to be a peon of the United States. American goods alone are in the shops and at prices 50 or 100% higher than in America itself. Even food such as butter and sugar and cheese and bacon seems to be largely imported and heavily taxed. There is much poverty and want. But what a spacious city it is! The gardens are fresh and flowering with violets, fountains are playing. The tradition of Spain is strong in the architecture which expresses the dignity of human life and of being a Spaniard. Alas, the most striking characteristic of the city is, I suppose, characteristic of all Mexico, and that is the pearl and ivory-mounted revolvers. There are shop windows full of pistols. Every other man has a pistol in his hip pocket. Pistols are discharged at all moments for joy or to kill or through mere ennui. The Mexicans fire off pistols to kill time. The city seems to have 2 regular restaurants, and you either dine with Kwong or dine with Sing. The city band plays in front of Porfirio Diaz's Palacio Nacional every afternoon. At the other end of the city, you may watch soldiers drilling. In the evening, there is nothing to do except watch barnstormers do an English musical comedy or look at an American picture show. On Sunday, it is true, there is always, at least in winter, a bullfight. These are not dressed as in Spain, though flower-decked bowers are put up for the queens of love and beauty, the presiding most distinguished ladies. Probably, when famous toreadors visit Chihuahua, they wear their crimson and gold, but in the glimpse I had of the killing of a 6th bull, the fighters were just men with their coats off. As it were, the butcher had taken a holiday from his shop, and with his long knife was taking extra pleasure in the darker side of his trade. The crowd kept calling to him to lead the bull away and bring out an ass, and blushingly he eyed the spot on the bull's neck where the knife ought to go and made the last lunge. "He is not a bullfighter, he's just an ordinary man," said someone as he went away. The state of Chihuahua has many bandits. Life there is remarkably insecure compared with north of the Rio Grande. This is not entirely due to Mexicans. There are not a few wild Americans at large. Hundreds of men wanted by the American police have in time past crowded into the state of Chihuahua, there to live largely by their wits. Two Gun Bill of cinema fame may be met with if you ride from the city to the mine with gold. Political assassins and men of blood are a state product. Thus, the life of General Villa and his murder there are natural enough. The horsemen of Chihuahua are much better mounted than the cowboys of the American Southwest. One may spend a pleasant afternoon on the town hall steps merely watching the horsemen riding in and out of town, and they are better armed and naturally more ready with hand to holster. The state was governed by General Enriquez, a Mexican liberal who has since resigned, but he had little control of the wild people about him. He had to cope with large numbers who believe they have won revolutionary reforms and with landowning families who are accustomed to treat the rest like slaves. Poor people still call you patron instead of señor. Enriquez staved off the demand for the splitting up and division of the large estates. He protected many business concerns from spoliatory labor laws. But he allowed the rule of daily payment of wages, a point much fought in the South. General Enriquez, who speaks English, is probably wider in his sympathies than most Mexicans. Wilford Ewart asked him a question direct. What did he think of the prospect of annexation by America? He replied that in his opinion the political ideas of America made that impossible. But if the wild forces now loose in Mexico should overthrow all the civilized elements of life, there hides the possible moment of an effective American intervention. I have not been surprised to read subsequently that the reason for Enriquez's resignation was despair. 4 days in Chihuahua is not long enough to judge the whole of the state, but any visitor might be struck by the daring faces of the Spaniards and by the almost complete savagery of the Indians. The latter, the Tarahumare, are black and nearly naked. They wear gigantic straw sombreros, and their bodies below are, as it were, triangled. Broad brows, sun-stretched eyes, broad nose but pointed chin. Their faces are triangular. Their bodies from shoulders to navel are black triangles. Their loincloths hang in a triangle of dull rags. Their thighs from the fullness of their loins to gaunt bony knees. 2 more triangles of dark dirt. And then wasted feet with mud-caked separate toes. A strange people, these Indians, for they worship the echinocactus and make sacrifice to it. The other citizens of this great state worship not the cactus, but the revolver. As I resumed my journey southward over hundreds more miles of desert, I noted that the man next to me kept a loaded revolver on the couch beside him, ready in case of bandidos. It is a wild country. What do foreigners go there for? Well, mostly for gold, for a fortune to be quickly won. We had some hope of meeting Wilfred Ewart at Chihuahua, but he had left before we came. We found his signature in the register of the Hotel Robinson. We had gone to a little Spanish hotel in the plaza called the San Luis. It seemed as if his 10 days would be over before we reached Mexico City. After Torreon, we began to watch for Laredo trains, not knowing that the railroad branches off at a much earlier point, Huehuetoca. It would have been amusing and pleasant to have shaken hands at some little station where our trains, going in different directions, were drawn up and steaming. But, as it happened, he had not left the capital. In the train were several mining men, mostly Americans. One came up to me and said, "I saw you at the Hotel Sheldon," and I said to my friends, "He's a mud digger, I'll bet." There, however, he was mistaken, but if you are English and in Mexico, it stands to reason you must be in the mining interest. The talk was of gold and opals and silver. Indians brought all manner of jewelry to the trains to sell, much of it manufactured stuff imported from Europe. They brought also lustrous pots, which were more genuine, and peasant embroideries and boxes of sweetened cream and baskets of strawberries. At Iraputo on the 26th of December, the whole station swarmed with vendors of strawberries. They say it always does, any time in the year. The train emerged from the waterless sand onto the maguey plantations. The eyes rested gratefully on the green plumes of the banana palm and on the scarlet flowers of some tropical tree. The bougainvillea bounced into a crimson effulgence of bloom. We entered at last a rich and verdant country fed by many rivers, and that was Anahuac, the fertile land of the Aztec Empire, of which the city now called Mexico, but in their day Tenochtitlan, is and was the capital. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of In Quest of El Dorado by Stephen Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24 at Montezuma's capital. Here the event happened which saddened the ear. My friend was killed. Wilfred Ewart, to whose genius and person I was devoted, and who in turn was very fond of us, was shot on Old New Year's night, a lamentable taking off over which one can never cease to grieve. Arrived at Mexico City, my wife and I sped along the Avenue Juarez to the Hotel Cosmos, where we spent a night. Next day, we repaired to the quieter and more comfortable Iturbide, a fine old structure built around stone courts in a garden of palm trees and flowering shrubs, with a fountain playing. I think we were fortunate, for while we paid only a moderate price, we yet had a large, airy room with writing desk and table and a pleasant outlook on the unfurling green of the banana palms. By no possibility could we have been shot from the street while standing at the window. We wondered much whether Wilfred Ewart were in the city. Although I knew he had only 10 days wherein his ticket would be valid, I knew the temptation was to stay longer. There is one perfectly safe and conventional hotel in Mexico City, and that is the Regis, run in the American style and patronized chiefly by Americans and English. Its agents circulate on the Pullman cars of the trains and make sure of the English-speaking passengers. and hotel omnibus meets all trains and takes off guests for the hotel. We felt sure, therefore, that Ewart would have stayed there. So on our first morning we went thither and asked for him. He was not there. We consulted the register. He had not been there. Next day I called on Mr. Norman King, the British Consul General, but the consulate had not heard of him. Dr. E. J. Dillon and his wife had, however, arrived in the city and were staying at the Princess, but Ewart was not registered at the Princess. We wondered where he could have stayed. As a matter of fact, a Spaniard on the train had given him the address of a hotel several streets distant from the center, the Hotel Isabel on the street of the Republic of San Salvador, a hotel chiefly patronized by Germans and Spanish. On Friday, the 29th of December, we went to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe and saw the famous image worshipped more by the Indians than by any other. We watched the Aztecs of today, candle in one hand, sombrero in the other, walk on their knees up the aisle to the altar, and looked on those grandiose ecclesiastical pictures which adorn the gilded church, telling the story of the revelation of the Virgin, and the Pope's remark, "Such things are not done for all nations." We recalled to mind December 12th, the festival of the Guadalupe Virgin, and the resonance of it at Santa Fe among the Mexicans there, the firing of guns promiscuously in the streets, the lighting of festive fires. It had much astonished Wilfred Ewart then. Next day, the 30th, at noontide, we met our friend by chance on the streets of the city. It was on the corner of San Juan de Lateran and the street of the 16th of September. We were in the act of choosing at which new restaurant we would partake of luncheon, when suddenly we saw Ewart's tall figure on the edge of the curb. He was gazing in his short-sighted way up into the sky, and did not see us till I cried out. Then we moved joyfully together to a restaurant and had lunch. "Well, Wilfred Ewart, you are a wicked fellow," I said to him reproachfully. He ruffled a little. "Well, I don't know," said he. "Isn't it the chance of a lifetime? I've been looking for a place like this all my life." He seemed utterly charmed with Mexico City, and spoke with a sort of rapture of Chapultepec Park. We agreed to go together on the morrow to San Angel to have lunch together on the last day of the year at the fine inn there. It was a place 9 or 10 miles from the center of the city, literally buried in flowers and palms, and he seriously thought of taking a room at the inn and staying there for 3 months. One thing troubled him. That iron box of regimental papers in his portmanteau had gone to New Orleans. He carried only his knapsack and staff, like a pilgrim bound for a distant shrine. He could sacrifice his unused ticket, but how to get these pieces of baggage forwarded to Mexico? We went after luncheon to talk to the railway agent about it, but the office was closed for the New Year holidays. I then accompanied him to his hotel, and saw the English-speaking German who kept it. "Surprisingly civil," said Ewart. Trying to ingratiate himself with me, I thought. I went up to his room and admired the fine view of the mountains obtained from his window, but I did not care for the feeling of it, not a place to write in. I meditated getting him to change over to the Iturbide. Next day, the 31st of December, we sat on a streetcar and went out together to San Angel. We had lunch in view of the great mountains Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, but their summits remained wreathed in cloud. A fine, warm air blew steadily thence, ruffling the blossoms of the garden, disturbing the eyes. Our luncheon was spread in an arbor. We were waited on by a French waiter. It was hardly a democratic resort. There were other arbors and tables set in a shady patio, where rich Mexicans who had driven up in their cars dissected elegantly cooked sole and turkey, and ate strawberries and cream washed down with imported wines. The straw-hatted, blanket-wrapped Mexicans, the descendants of the Aztecs, the women with gold ornaments on their necks and ears and flowing raven hair, were hidden from view here. One might very well have been on the Riviera, except for those gigantic volcanoes and a certain dryness of the Table Mountain air which spoke not of the sea. Ewart had already been to the inn several times. He had been ill at ease in American civilization and told us so. He thirsted for the elegance of Paris and the easygoing ways of London. "One thing the Americans have not yet learned to prize, and that is leisureliness," said he. His own marked, leisured utterance was strangely in contrast with the rapid speech and style of the Americans. Yet he was going back to America in the spring. He felt the fascination of modern America as much as anyone. He was surprised that America had not yet annexed Mexico. Ideal considerations did not weigh in his mind. The only argument in favor of Mexico was that Mexico was unlike the United States, and it might be worthwhile conserving her as something different. Of them and of many things we discoursed during the long afternoon spent mostly on the roof of the San Angel Inn, and in the dust of the evening we took a returning tram to Mexico. As we passed the bull ring at Chapultepec, the outcoming crowd swarmed onto the streets, and ere we reached the city, the newsboys with the evening papers came clamorously onto the cars, crying, "Glorious afternoon with the bulls! Great triumph of Rodolfo Gaon! Great triumph of Lalanda!" Gaon is an Indian bullfighter and the idol of Mexico for a time. Ewart had seen him kill 4 bulls in his garments of gold and silver, and was hideously impressed. But he was greatly tickled by the news cry, "Glorious afternoon with the bulls," and kept repeating it. That evening we went together to the Teatro Lirico to see a review called 1922. We sat in the midst of a wild crowd and looked on at something of which we did not understand very much, allusions of all kinds of happenings in the Republic of Mexico during 1922, danced out by girls and clowns in colored silks. There were acts representing the 2 years' peace of the Obregon regime, liberty, the graves of the martyrs of the Revolution, and through it all there stalked a hooligan, drunk in every scene and creating a scandal in every part. In the graveyard of the heroes, he makes love to the widow grieving over her dead husband, and is only interrupted when the grave opens and the dead man inside roars a terrible reproval, the thrill of the evening. The whole ended on a sort of parade of the Republic and a rivalry of flags over which in a grand burst of the national anthem triumphed the red, white, and green of the Mexican nation. By the time we came out of the theater, it had become a wild night in Mexico City. Everyone who had a car had brought it out. All the camions were filled with joyriders, every klaxon and horn was yelling, the sidewalks were packed with thronging crowds carrying colored paper flags and other baubles. Most of the men had pistols, some had guns. Promiscuous firing rattled and banged in side streets and about housetops. The cafes were full. Orchestras were playing. Men everywhere were under the influence of pulque and other cactus alcohols. I think we felt rather tired. Certainly, we were ready for supper, and we sought a table where we might sit down to eat and finish the night. It was at the Cosmos that we sat down to supper for the last time. There we lingered, and would no doubt have seen the old year out, the new year in, but an unkind fate prompted otherwise. At 11:30 or thereabout, we sallied forth once more into the wild street. I had a mind to go to the great central square, the Zocalo, where once stood the Great Pyramid, but we did not agree to go. Instead, we gave one another last greetings and departed to our several hotels. "A Happy New Year!" Ewart cried, swaying his arm affectionately in a last handshake. "And a Happy New Year," said I, "and may you soon get that iron box," I added, involuntarily thinking of what was most on our minds. So we parted. Even the Iturbide was in a strange condition, most of the servants being in that menacing drunken state which comes after drinking much pulque. But that was a small matter. At midnight there outbroke a quintupled clamor over all the city. Hundreds of thousands of revolvers and guns must have been discharged, and discharged repeatedly. The sound was of a great general engagement in war. I stood at the window and looked into the dark sky, which, however, told nothing of the myriads of bullets flying into it. I was astonished. But little did I guess that Wilfred Ewart, doing the same thing at his window overlooking that wild street to the Republic of San Salvador, was in these moments being killed by a revolver bullet from below. Yet so it was, and I will not say more here, except that we buried him in the British cemetery beside the Tlacopan causeway along which Cortes and the remains of his defeated army slowly retreated on the Noche Triste of July 1st, 1520. A few English people stood beside a new-dug grave with tearful eyes and choking hearts. So we laid him to rest, far away from his home. There were white roses buried with him. There are lilies growing near him. I should not, perhaps, have narrated this happening here, but that Wilfred Ewart has become a part of Mexico as Francis Drake became a part of Nombre de Dios and the Spanish Main. It was Mexico that took him, sacrificing yet another victim on its Aztec altars. On the day after we buried Ewart, another Englishman was killed, George W. Stebbin, an English merchant. He was walking along a street with his family when suddenly a shooting affray took place between two parties of Mexicans in cars. Shots went in many directions, several people were wounded, and Stebbin was killed. The quarreling parties were mostly officers and deputies, really above the law. Members of the Mexican Parliament enjoy immunity from arrest, but nevertheless they are frequently implicated in crimes and outrages. The social condition of Mexico has evidently greatly changed since Diaz's days. Porfirio Diaz ruled as a dictator for a quarter of a century and enforced peace upon the country. He was the type of great man that Carlyle sought in history, the hero once found to be obeyed. The obedience to Diaz was very gratifying to foreigners in Mexico. His fame was extraordinary in his day, but now none so poor as to do him reverence. His name is not heard. Streets are not named after him, nor monuments raised to him. His name represents bondage and oppression to the masses. The 10 years of civil war and revolution which followed the Diaz regime were no doubt strongly colored by the personal ambitions of aspirants to the presidency, but the violence of them came from a popular upheaval arising out of the depths. What has happened in Mexico is not unakin to what has happened in Russia. The Mexican Revolution began before the success of the Bolsheviks, but it obtained a powerful inspiration from Russia. Mexican politicians came to Europe to study the Bolshevism, and in one or two states, notably those of Veracruz and Yucatan, it can be said that a dictatorship of the proletariat has been achieved. Bourgeois society and the enormous capitalistic concerns of Mexico are menaced by proletarianism. The force of the law has been greatly weakened by this revolutionary triumph. Every Mexican feels that he is a law to himself, and that he must be ready to protect himself should he be set upon. Hence the prevalence of firearms in the possession of citizens, and the many assaults, murders, accidents. I suppose in no other capital in the world, not even in Russia, could a funeral cortege of a dead communist be followed by banners inscribed, "Viva Anarchia! Long live anarchy!" Nor could a tram strike, such as we had this January, end in an armed battle in the streets and nobody be punished. There is much that is remarkable about Mexico City. It is an Indian capital, a Spanish capital, and an American capital in one. All three clash, producing a city of strange unrest. The Americans want only business, the Spanish believe they want culture, the Indians want only freedom. Spanish and Indians together make up the Mexican people, which, on the whole, is mentally deficient. They are loquacious and lose themselves talking. When they take to arms, they do so without mathematics. Impregnable as Mexico seems, any civilized nation could defeat her in war because, to use a colloquialism, she is not all there. That is why, in my opinion, in the first place, Cortes with his handful of warriors was able to destroy the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs had a fourth part lacking in their mental equipment. Montezuma magnificent as he was clearly, from a European point of view, something of a half-wit. That half-wittedness the Spaniards married gaily into, and have not been able to throw it off. The conqueror has become the conquered. Mexico is a city of some enchantment. It is not a place that can be understood at once, like Kalamazoo or a standard American city. It holds you puzzled. The squads of arum lilies, the joyous fountains playing under evergreen trees, the prattling children, and the noonday tropical sun do not entirely give the mood of the city. It is not one of innocence. Or again, the busy American and English businessmen, the gay modish shops of the Avenida Madero, the foyer of the most exclusive American hotel, or the buzz of English talk from mining men and drummers in Sanborn's Cafe, they also do not convey the mood of the old Aztec capital. Its air of modern business is deceptive. The daytime activities seem to be a veil of the real city. It is, in many respects, very pleasant by day, more pleasant for the business people than for anyone else, I think. At night, the city is different. The sense of security is less, the feeling of the presence of the unknown is much greater. The underworld of the city is terrible, and no student of life could shut his eyes to it. Poverty widespread and staring, a morose, drunken male population, women who suffer more than most poor women, everyone morose, melancholy, fierce, threatening faces much commoner than smiling ones. There is a thin upper crust of rich people, very thin and very swell, who own fine villas and have their cars. And their womenfolk dress and parade in the motor car parade, which at a certain hour continually blocks the way on the Avenida Madero, while their chauffeurs with their horns shriek importance to the traffic police. These people shop at the fine shops and pay 3 prices for American goods, foregoing their own Mexican foods and manufactured ware for expensive imports. The real Mexican population is herded into a district called by the Americans the Thieves' Market, a great open place where the Aztecs used to exercise themselves. And there you may see women lined up in scores, holding in their hands chili sandwiches, all they have to sell, and supplicating you to buy. In their faces you see something of the mood of the city. When Cortés came, he found a stately city. He found also a place of gloom and awe, a city of slavery, of human sacrifice, of fanatical, unbending paganism. His brutal, adventurous 400 tasted there the greatest fear of their lives, and met, of course, in one battle the greatest disaster that Spanish arms ever met at Indian hands. At that time, the greatest feature of the city was the grand square of the pyramid, which is now called the Zocalo and has become the terminus of all the swirling streetcars and of hundreds of pirate buses. There, 8 great causeways approached a grand open place, the center of which was the stone-faced pyramid, the altar of Huitzilopochtli, god of war. The pyramid was cemented, its base was conglomerated with jade, emerald, and gold, and for that reason it was picked to bits by Spanish soldiers. Not one stone remained in situ when the Christian cathedral was started to be built. On top of the pyramid stood the gigantic sacrificial stone, now in a museum hard by, and into the cavity in the middle of the stone were flung thousands of warm hearts still beating in death. Did not the barbarity of the Aztec rituals go far to justify the brutality of Cortés's followers? One night, the Noche Triste of July 1st, 1520, Cortés saw his own Spaniards led to ghastly sacrifice, whilst hundreds of sacred fires lit up the sides and stone stairways and platforms of this pyramid and shone luridly on the faces of the priests and the Spanish victims and the ecstatic Indians. That marked the end of Montezuma's reign. That great square is all encroached on now by shops and wretched arcades, and instead of the pyramid, a squat cathedral, trying, as it were, to cover an original ground plan of paganism without any architectural plan. Half the open space is gone. Groves of low electric light standards supplied by an American foundry shed unnecessary glimmer on petty garden plots, and all the grandeur has gone. Nevertheless, somehow at night the gloom and ancient horror of the square creeps out. Aztec beggars, half-Aztecs, quarter-Aztecs, shades of Aztecs, make for you threateningly and yet supplicatingly. Pulque-stricken men stare at you from their doped eye sockets. The 8 streets are there, ill-lit, full of darkness, noise, and beggars. The drivers and the hangers-on of the pirate buses yell their destinations: Tacuba, Roma, Piedad, San Angel. In churches in the gloom you may see converted Indians creep from the door to the altar on their knees. Outside the churches, beggars are seen kneeling in silence, their lean faces and fevered eyes set, as it were, upon some star. They kneel and stare, hour after hour, and it seems nothing to them who passes by or what they receive in alms. There is something of the spirit of Quapopoca and Cuauhtemoc, whom the Spanish burned over slow fires, who fixed their eyes upon a point, and burned, and did not say a word. What is truly remarkable is that no 10 minutes passes in the night without the sound somewhere of a gunshot, a revolver shot. To the violent street crowds, shooting in air is an amusement. You walk carefully and circumspectly in the streets at night. It is true, of course, that they killed my friend here, and it preys on the mind. But to me, Mexico City refuses to correspond to any type of civilization. It is still the city of the pyramid of Huitzilopochtli. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of In Quest of El Dorado by Stephen Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25, In the Footsteps of Cortez. 1. Cortez. Yucatan, the site of the ruins of the Maya civilization, was the first part of Mexico to be discovered, for it was the point of the mainland nearest to the Indies. De Cordova visited it in 1516, 1517, Juan de Grijalva called there in 1518, and, going further, searched the coast of the Gulf for islets. He was recalled and dishonored, though it is recorded that he was a most honorable man. Honor among pirates is no saving virtue. Cortez followed him, and he had the craft and style to play hero or villain as occasion offered. The Spanish wanted gold. They did not want glory, least of all anyone else's glory. Cortez, however, had as great an eye for glory as he had for gold. That he was a great man, few who read his history can doubt. He had to fight not only the Indians, but the headstrong Spaniards of his own following, the malevolent Velasquez, governor of Cuba, who had control of his supplies, and even the enemies in far-off Spain who hid his glories from the emperor. How he resigned his office and got himself elected by his own troops, how he persuaded them to burn their boats so that there could be no return, how he reinforced his army by capturing an army set against him, how he beguiled Montezuma and fooled him. This is a great story, revealing a character which it might have delighted Shakespeare to describe. But what Cortez was, and what he and his followers achieved, are 2 different matters. The brilliance of the exploits of Cortez has blinded many to the sordid, material nature of the deeds effected. It is true he cast down 1,000 altars of blood and washed away the hideous scarlet stain, putting up white crosses with flowers and Madonnas to whom could be no reproach. But there the ideal side of the adventure ended. The rest was vulgar spoliation, the furtherance of one quest only, the making of a fortune to take back to Spain. Before Cortez's expedition, no one had surmised the wealth of Mexico. The Spanish of the Indies wasted their time kidnapping natives and selling them to slavers, not knowing that El Dorado was just a little further out of doors. But Cortez readily grasped that there were rich kingdoms to sack. He founded Vera Cruz with the name Rich City of the True Cross. He marched to meet the Totonacs at Sempoala and found a people who wore golden necklaces and bracelets and rings of gold, gems in their noses and ears, headdresses of gold. Spanish eyes stared sultrily at these ornaments on the persons of a tribe who were friends. Some must have wished the Totonacs were enemies. The fame of Mexico City determined Cortes to march toward it. Health lay in that direction, for a mountain wall had to be scaled, and even a day's march took the army out of the fever flats of Vera Cruz. He climbed up to Jalapa, the city of flowers, and thence to the heights of the plateau, where at Xocotlan he found 13 high temples and pyramids made of tens of thousands of human skulls. The Totonacs accompanied him all the way, for they told of another tribe which might ally itself with Cortes, the Tlaxcaltecs, who had constantly fought the Aztecs and never been beaten by them. The Tlaxcaltecs fought Cortes first to see what his troops were made of, and nearly worsted him. But afterwards, having tested him and liked him, they became his best and most lasting friends. Through them, more than through his own Spaniards or through the help of God, he won. A month after he left the shore, Cortes entered Tlaxcala and was given a marvelous flower festival. Thence Cortes marched to the pious Cholultecs at the Pyramid of Cholula and massacred them. And then he built a causeway over the collar which holds the two volcanoes, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, and marched by Izcalpan and Oyotzinco to the lakes and canals of the Valley of Mexico. From Iztapalapan, now at the end of a tramway, he marched to the great meeting of welcome with Montezuma and his nobles. 2. Veracruz. Mexico City had become haunted for us since Wilfred Ewart's death, and we were glad when occasion offered to go down to the lower country, to Veracruz and the historical country between that city and the capital. Up and down these heights, soldiers have constantly streamed in battle. It is Mexico's fighting ground, scene of her victories and of her defeats. Of the port of Veracruz, the old Villa Rica, I will say little except that it has become a place of great commercial and military importance. It is not so great a port as Havana or New Orleans, but it is clearly capable of development to a point of rivalry with these. With all her great seaboard, Mexico is, nevertheless, greatly deficient in natural harbors. The Pacific side is even poorer than the Atlantic side. For that reason, Veracruz ought to have an enormous trade. Strategically, also, an attacking force is somewhat dependent on Veracruz. It is the obvious base for an invading army. Cortes started thence in 1520, the Americans in 1846, the French in 1860, and in the abortive war of 1913-1914, it was occupied by the American Marines who had outposts even as far inland as Los Cocos. The Great War showed how easily it could be defended by mines, but I doubt if the Mexicans have enough intelligence to apply the lessons of the war to the defense of their own country. The Turks learned to use mines in Asia Minor and cleared Smyrna of foreign ships. But the Mexicans are less intelligent than the Turks, less capable of defending themselves against foes. During the American occupation of 1913-1914, a great work of sanitation and cleansing was carried out, and the city has never been again the pest hole it was. Some of the scavenging then begun has been carried on. There is a notable decrease in fevers and plague. Yellow fever, for which it had a very evil name, has almost disappeared. It is worth noting that wherever the American army has been sent to keep order or to take possession, the general physical health of the community has been benefited. Veracruz now, under a revolutionary administration, is not a pleasant city for visitors. Make the foreigner pay is applied by all and sundry to those who have to pass through the port for business or pleasure. Porters, hotels, shops, all are operated on this plan, and it defeats itself, for no one stays in the city longer than he can help. The whole state suffers from economic disorganization, personal greed, sloth, and violence. Against this strive many American and British and German companies. If there is anything clean or practical or prepossessing, it derives from these countries. It is easy to grasp that if the companies were forced to retreat, the Spanish-speaking community would revert to the primitive state. It is a very Indian state, though Negro blood is mixed in on the coast as it is not in the interior. Negroes in the company with Jews and Moors have been generally excluded from Mexico, but at Veracruz and Tampico and Puerto Mexico there has naturally been some admixture. The Indian mentality has triumphed, but it is a weak one. The favorite buffoonery of the natives when Cortes called on them to surrender and they refused was to cry out, "We shall eat you with chili tomorrow. We believe you will taste well." Today, modern civilization is in the place of Cortes, and still it challenges the Mexicans, and they cry out, "We'll have you with the chili." 3. The city of Jalapa. Cortes marched up to it from the sea. Montezuma's messengers met him with golden ducks, discs of the sun in gold, large stones of jade, gifts of plumed armor and golden arrows, and they prayed him to go away. Jalapa was the chief city of the Totonac Indians. It was a city of flowers. There were silver houses there. There were blood altars. Cortes said, no, he would not go away till he had delivered in person a message which he bore from the King of Spain. That message he invented, but he had a message, nevertheless, obtained out of the Book of Fate, and in due time he delivered it. His message dissolved the Aztec Empire and laid low the greatest cultural achievement of the Indians. Anahuac became New Spain. 400 years have just passed since the conquest was achieved, but the Mexicans have not marked it with festivity. Cortes's bones have been driven from cathedral to cathedral, and his memory has become unhallowed. Jalapa, famous for centuries for the export of jalap, is today very different from anything it ever was in the past. It is the capital of a Bolshevik state. Nowhere during the 10 years revolutionary struggle which followed the fall of Diaz did the proletariat gain more control than in the state of Veracruz, and Jalapa is its capital. It should be understood that the United States of Mexico are very much disunited in politics. In 5 or 6 of them, such as Tlaxcala, there are actually 2 legislatures, old and new regime, trying to sit at the same time. But it is safe to say that the majority in all Mexico is radical and very decidedly anti-capitalistic. Where the distribution of the land among the peasants has not been carried out, there are continual armed raids. The Mexican landowners and bourgeois are busy organizing a fascisti movement, but that has little chance of success unless the President of the Republic favored them. Obregón, however, is an enigmatical personage. He is anti-capitalistic, but he is ready with federal troops to quell riots of the proletariat. His popularity with the masses is waning, but his ability to govern the country shows itself more and more powerfully. The trial of his strength comes between now and the 1924 elections. Mexico depends on him almost as it depended on Diaz. When he goes from power, the revolution in its fury may easily break out again. Jalapa, in which we spent some 10 days, is a city of red demonstrations. The agrarians and the cooperatists parade with their blood-red banners and violent inscriptions. They occupy the town hall or the governor's palace, and their leaders harangue the crowds from the balconies. The governor himself lends a hand. Men with red flags climb the steeple of the cathedral, and whenever a strong break of oratory is made from the town hall balcony below, they ring the cathedral bells with a grand clash. What is the matter? The workmen of the maritime zone have boycotted an oil company on which depend for fuel all the railways of the South and most of the factories. Half Mexico is in danger of economic paralysis. It was so all the winter of 1922-23. The company, an English one, was holding out against a proposed 75% increase in wages, wages to be paid daily, premiums on dismissal, etc. Wages paid daily is a great feature of the labor demand, the idea being to make it more easy to go on strike. There has also been a new rent campaign, whole populations refusing to pay rent. When, in Veracruz, you decide no longer to pay rent, you hang out a red flag from your window. There is also, here as in most of the states, a strained relationship between the Indian peasants and their former masters, the landowners. Against red rule, the newspapers of Mexico have arrayed themselves, especially Excelsior, Mr. Lloyd George's Mexican platform, and El Dictamen, both run in favor of capitalism and common sense. But one of the latest phenomena has been a boycott of these papers in the maritime zone, largely organized by the governor of Veracruz himself. It is lucky for the people of Jalapa that the currency of Mexico is federally controlled and is of gold or silver. Otherwise, one can imagine the inflation of paper money that would take place in a state run on the lines of that of Veracruz. As it is, the disorganization caused by strikes has raised the cost of living to almost double that of the quieter states of Oaxaca and Puebla. How important this condition of affairs is may be judged from the fact that Veracruz is the key of the republic. Mexico has been 3 times conquered and its capital taken by Spain, by the United States, and by France, and all 3 campaigns started from Veracruz. Did not the American soldiers in 1848 play baseball in Jalapa with the president of Mexico's wooden leg? That was the time of one-legged Santa Anna. Now is the time of one-armed Obregón. Despite the great army of Mexico today, one cannot help feeling that in cases of foreign intervention via Veracruz and Jalapa, there would not be enough moral power to resist invasion. Still, whatever happens, there is one thing in which Jalapa will not change, never has changed, that is, in the grandeur of her scenery. The city is, unfortunately, often in the clouds, and warm, rolling mists enwrap its stone ways and houses, whilst jackdaws innumerable create unearthly hubbub in the twilight. But when the clouds vanish, the landscape appears. The mountains lift themselves in great steps to Himalayan heights. Jalapa is on a ledge 5,000 feet above the sea. She is halfway up the Sierra Madre, and above her, above all our clouds, stands Orizaba, 20,000 feet high, which great snow-covered mountain has often been called the guardian spirit of Mexico. Orizaba watches the sea, and should she see approaching gods or men, she passes the word to Popocatépetl, the guardian of the capital. Orizaba must have passed on many messages in her time, though not with much avail. 4. At Tlaxcala. Tlaxcala surely is the most romantic place in Mexico, the little mountain city whence Cortés gleaned his greatest allies, an Indian Sparta. The Tlaxcaltecs displayed a devotion to the Spaniards which in its unthinking generosity was very characteristic of the Indians. At a word from Malinche, as they affectionately called him, they even changed their religion and consented to be baptized. They never foresaw how the Spaniards in victory would prove ungrateful. They reinforced Cortés in thousands and went with him to Cholula. The Cholultecs hated them, and while pretending to receive Cortés amiably, demanded that the Tlaxcaltecs camp outside and not inside their city bounds. When, with his allies, Cortés fell on the Cholultecs, it was natural that the insulted Tlaxcaltecs did great execution, had in fact eventually to be restrained. The highlanders of Tlaxcala spared neither breath nor spoil. They were almost as avid in victory as the Spaniards themselves. But a nod from Cortés was enough to hold them in check. They gladly followed his horses and men to Montezuma and made no small show of danger to the hated Aztecs. The Aztecs were the imperialists of their days, oppressing the lower races, but unable to quell the Tlaxcaltecs. Tlaxcala, therefore, marched against Montezuma. And when Cortés on the dreadful night was beaten, Tlaxcala still stood by him, enabling him to return to the field and when. You approach Tlaxcala by narrow lanes all fenced with candelabra cactus. This cactus, branching near its root, grows in green pillars as regularly as the stems of a branched candlestick. Sometimes it is called the organ cactus from its likeness and shape to organ pipes. These pipes or pillars grow close to one another to a height of 6 or 7 feet when young, often to 20 feet when matured. They make the simplest and most effective of palings, for their barbs forbid anyone struggling to get through them. The old stone ways of Tlaxcala, worn by myriads of bare feet of Indians, are now hedged with this cactus, and you walk from the old fields up to what were once citadels, temples, palaces, now in shapeless ruin and overheaped with mold and overgrown with flowers. You may sit up there among the mountains and muse on what was Tlaxcala. 8,000 feet up, the ancient city was higher than the new one, and it was much larger. Tlaxcala has decayed. It supported the sturdy warriors and their families of pure Tlaxcaltec origin. Seemingly, the half-Spanish breed is idler, lazier, and has not taken kindly to a bleak sight of civilization and life. The windy city is cold and poor. Its chief life is in its soldiery, who make of it a stamping ground. The drums and fifes make a great clangor in the stone-walled, echoing city, a hubbub which does not cease all day. The soldiers march well on the cobbles and certainly make a smart turnout. One's sympathies are with them and with Mexico until a plain-clothes colonel with a riding whip comes on the scene and flogs the soldiers as they march. That brutality immediately alienates one's affections. Surprising that the soldiers stand it after the Revolution, but they are bound in the traditions of peonage. Disaffection takes longer to breed in them than it has done in the ex-serfs of Russia. The most remarkable objects in Tlaxcala are, however, the churches. There you may see the large stone font in which Xicotencatl, the old general, and all the leading Indians consented to be baptized in 1520, in their nakedness and with the rites of the Catholic Church. The mind can visualize a remarkable scene. The old pulpit whence, after they were baptized, they were sermonized in Spanish is also there and in situ. And you may see the first pictures of the new gods, the first pictures of Christ and the Madonna specifically painted by Cortez's men and sent as gifts to the first Christian chapel of the Indians. These are appalling in their ugliness. The ugliness of death has been added to the ugliness of madness, and together in one face something has been obtained worthy of fear. No loving Savior was presented to the Tlaxcaltecs, but a worse bogey than their own. Their god of war was ugly and authorized terrible deeds in his name, but the god of the Christians was more terrible and, as would be proved, would apparently preside over worse human acts, over slaughters, tortures, and human fires innumerable. It is curiously naive that the Spanish missionaries to Mexico constantly averred, "Your religion is not unlike ours, only the names of the gods are different." 5. The Pyramid of Cholula. Since the discovery of the tomb of King Tutankhamun, there has been in Mexico an amusing feeling of jealousy of Egypt. The era of the mythical Atlantis has been pitted against the era of the biblical pharaohs. Archaeologists in Yucatan are reputed to be digging feverishly for some remains of the Maya civilization which will divert the interest of the world from Luxor. I have, however, stood in the king's chamber in the center of Cheops Pyramid, and now I have stood on the apex of the Great Pyramid of Cholula, and though the remains of Mexico's past are impressive, Egypt is by far the more haunting to a European mind. The thought, however, strikes one, what if, in that era of the past when these pyramids were built, the people of these lands so far apart knew one another? Is it possible that the repute of the pyramids of Egypt raised the pyramids of Mexico? At the time when Cortez came, the Aztecs were building pyramids as fast as we build churches. But there were several pyramids in the land which had been there before the Aztecs came to the country, ascribed to Toltecs and Chichimecs and other imperial races which have had their day. The Aztecs hewed massive altars of stone and raised them to the heights of the old pyramids, and they made human sacrifice on them and lit votive flames which glared red in the night as the army of Cortes marched inland from the sea. Cholula was the holy city of Anahuac, possessing many temples. It was a center of pagan piety, conservative, uncompromising. Cortes did not believe its people could possibly be his friends, and so, with the psychology of a tragedy villain, he suddenly, in the midst of friendly seeming, accused them of treachery and put them to the sword. The populace took refuge on the 120 steps of the Great Pyramid, which had then superstructures of wood, but the Spaniards fired it, and all who stood on the pyramid perished, even the priest who came out on the apex invoking Quetzalcoatl, the god of the air. The priest, in a shroud of flame, burned to death in the sight of all who were below. The remaining Cholultecs fled to the hills. Cortes put up a cross on the apex of the pyramid, and then rode away. The massacre of Cholula was one of the chief crimes charged against Cortes by his enemies in Spain. That it was a dark and impolitic act was not denied, and had the Emperor Montezuma been a warlike monarch, he would have met the Spaniards straightway in arms and would certainly have destroyed them. He had hundreds of thousands at his command, but the army of Cortes was only a little over 400 men. But Montezuma, abounding in manners and piety, was notably deficient in brains and pluck. Cortes built a causeway from Cholula to the saddle of the ridge which separates Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the great volcanoes, and from the height he and his followers looked down on the rich valley of the capital and upon the scene of a decade of loot and centuries of struggle. When they reached the city, the emperor came out in friendly guise to meet them, and Montezuma bade Cortes sit upon his right hand as an equal. So the destruction of Cholula was proved no error. The Spaniards won their way. They obtained vast quantities of gold, later to be lost. They sacked the pagan temples and destroyed not only the false god, but all the records of the people. They put up Christian churches. They carved out the viceroyalty of New Spain. As they had no women of their own, they took Indian wives. Every Spaniard in those days was a Solomon, and they bred the Mexican who now appears. I stood on the top of that old pyramid of Cholula. I climbed by an old stone way, not seldom stepping over stones graven with hieroglyphics of a lost religion. Beside an old cross, and in the shadow of a Catholic church, I looked on what was Cholula, a squat city with a petrol streetcar running through it, a dozen old rusty-colored churches built of the stones of shattered Aztec temples, a vast, ill-kept city square where a large army could be assembled, but now tenanted by 50 Indian women selling wares which were spread on the dirt, herbs, fruits, cottons, imitation jewelry. A fountain with stone angels, but no water inscribed to Philip III, King of Spain and the Indies. Poor people, beshawled women, barefooted men with ancient, grimy, high-crowned hats of straw. Change has followed change. By the last revolution in Mexico, the Indian has attained equality with the Spaniard. He has in many parts seized the lands of the Spanish. The great haciendas are no more. As a working man, the Indian terrorizes the capital. And as for the Catholic Church, into which his forefathers were forcibly baptized, he comes daily to spurn it more. In no other Catholic country in the world is Catholicism more openly humiliated than in Mexico. Is not the popular craze of the time a climbing of the facades of the cathedrals by acrobats and small boys, a kicking off of the noses of the saints in order to advertise beer? Whilst the papal nuncio is told sharply to pack up and quit the country with less notice than would be given a general servant, the petty indignities are manifold and great. As I go from Cholula in the night and look behind me, I see a light burning above the apex of the pyramid. No, not the fires of Quetzalcoatl broken out again, only an electric lamp hung above the cross of the church that you may know it is there. 6. Tenochtitlan. Puebla, the third largest city in modern Mexico, has grown up near Cholula, one of the few cities that has no Indian history behind it. Puebla was built by the Spaniards and exclusively populated by Spaniards. There, at least, the Indian woman was not a bride. Something purely Spanish was bred there as a racial bulwark against possible foes. It remains today the most Spanish of all the cities of Mexico, and therefore the most conservative and the most unalterably Catholic. Puebla is a beautiful and quiet city, largely adorned by the brightly colored tiles which are a feature of its architecture. Facades of terracotta and gold, purple and yellow tiled domes are commonplace features of the churches. Around the great cathedral are pillars supporting 100 angels, and each angel holds an electric light, which is generally burning all day as well as all night. Mimosa and palm trees grow over the cool green lawns of the plaza, and lilies bloom beside many fountains. There is some military parade, as at Tlaxcala, and upon occasion a reactionary demonstration. The industrial life is greatly hit by revolutionary economics, and it seems impossible for the city to get back to the prosperity which it used to enjoy. Like Jalapa, Puebla is an important strategic point. It has been the scene of many battles, and a short walk outside the gates of the city brings you to the old trenches of Frenchmen and Spaniards. In the American War of 1846 to 1848, the plaza of the town was occupied by a little army and many wounded and sick, and the Americans defended it against all comers, talking and bluffing as well as firing and barricading for a whole month, when they received reinforcements and were able to withdraw. This can be said for Puebla and its more purely Spanish population. It is more honest, more dignified, less drunken than Mexico City or Veracruz or any of the cities where the Indians are in strength. The way to Mexico City from Puebla tells something of the debauch of the people. It is over 100 miles, and the country is rich either for pasture or for cultivation of grain. Rainfall is abundant. Heat and cold are seldom in extremes. But you see no herds grazing here, and very few cornfields. Instead, there are interminable vistas of cultivated cactus, the maguey raised merely for pulque, for the drink that stupefies the nation that takes to it. The freight cars marked pulque only block the lines. At the railway station, women in scores come to the trains with pulque bottles. The only rich are the owners of the pulque farms, and you see them on silver-mounted saddles, pricking their fine horses with silver spurs. They are on the one hand, and a vast, ragged, sodden population on the other. Thus to San Juan and the pyramids of the sun, and the salt lakes and the canals and the floating gardens, to Texcoco and Chalco and Xochimilco, to Iztapalapa and the metal-shod causeway by which Cortes marched to the city. Iztapalapa is a sad place now, like a sort of Arab village, except for the visiting tramcar which comes out from the great metropolis, loops a loop at the plaza, and returns through the dust and dirt to the Zocalo, the square of the Great Pyramid in Mexico City. Near where Montezuma and Cortes met, now stands ugly but powerful and suggestive national monuments, of Indian warrior and squaw, designed for the Zocalo but felt by the Mexicans to be too indelicate for a prominent public place. The Mexicans of today are proud of their Indian blood, but do not care to be reminded too realistically of what the Indians were. The squat, broad-nosed, large-mouthed, pendulous-cheeked faces, the short legs, the barrel-shaped bodies, the feather ornaments, the war clubs and darts, do not appeal to the mind of the modern Mexican, who would rather think of his ancestors as debonair, Frenchified, with faces and bodies like those of Greek or Roman heroes. Montezuma regaled the Spaniards very well, not only feeding them and gilding them with presents, but bestowing upon each soldier a bevy of wives. There was not one who had less than 10 wives. Cortes could not find his men. They were lost among the young squaws. He was obliged to limit the number of female servants, but Montezuma, hearing of the trouble, arranged special quarters for the harems of the soldiers. Cortes himself was much embarrassed by the number of princesses he was called upon to marry. He had his troubles with the women. Did he not push his first wife down a well? And, according to the historians, he made great scruple against taking new ties. However, he took to himself the peerless Marina, who helped him greatly in his conquest of her brother Indians. The Aztecs, it appears, had no code of morals kin to those current in the Old World. Sensual lust was not a violent passion amongst them. They bought and sold their women, lived polygamously, but women were not centers of voluptuousness. Thus, it seems, has remained. The Mexican is not hot-blooded over women. He is comparatively cold, and the women are demure and chaste. The contrast, for instance, between Cuban and Mexican is considerable. The mixed blood of Spaniard and Negro is very lustful. The mixed blood of Spaniard and the Indian is cold and self-sufficient in the matter of sex. One reads of the bestowal of beautiful girls upon the Spaniards, but the beauty was doubtless exaggerated. It is difficult to find much feminine beauty among the Aztecs now. There is a moment of unearthly beauty, just a moment, early in the teens, and then the Aztec girl goes heavy and repulsive-looking, her coal-black hair becomes coarse as a horse's mane, her bosom spreads, dirt gets the better of her body. The Mexicans of all classes are remarkably indelicate and dirty. As for their children, a foreigner might be tempted to caress them or play with them, but a glance at the faces causes him to draw away his hands from the unwashed skins and sores. There is no doubt that the Spaniards, in allying themselves to the Aztecs, joined themselves to a race which was lower than themselves. In their romantic attitude to the Aztecs, it is often forgotten that they were cannibals and ate their prisoners of war. A race whose instincts permitted them to do that was obviously in a degraded state. It may safely be said that the Aztecs had no great future, even if Cortes had not come. They were brutal, mentally deficient and depraved, possessed of rites and customs repellent to all who possess a living God. 7. In the Marquisate of Oaxaca. Cortes was recognized and rewarded, and he made a happy end of life. He overcame all the intrigues. His success, like a rising sun, triumphed over all mists and clouds, and at its zenith shone over half the world. His emperor honored him and granted to him and his heirs in perpetuity the lands of the valley of Oaxaca with all of the wealth therein contained, both potential and actual. On the strength of it, the Cortes of today ought to be Morgans or Rothschilds. Oaxaca is one of the most golden valleys of Mexico, a marvelous place, El Dorado itself in the eyes of the first pioneers who grabbed what they could carry and lost what they could not defend. Hernando Cortes became the Marquis of the Valley, known commonly in Spanish annals as the Great Marquis, a title which in British history is, however, associated with a nobler man, the Marquis of Montrose. Oaxaca, pronounced Oaxaca, is some 300 miles southwest of the capital, reached by rocky, narrow, and often precipitous trails, once the secret knowledge of Indians, but now followed by a railroad considered a marvel of scientific engineering. No motor road goes through, and it is adventurous going for either horseman or pedestrian. It is one of the ways to the Pacific shore, and once the capital of the Marquisate is reached, it is not a difficult journey on horseback to Tehuantepec or Salina Cruz down on the quiet beaches of the southern sea. It should be said that Oaxaca is now a state, and that the heirs of Cortes have long since dissipated their fortunes. English and Americans now own the most valuable properties of the valley, which is recognized still as one of the richest mining districts of Mexico. Oaxaca has enriched thousands of individuals. Mexicans without doing work pathetically hope to stumble suddenly on large fortunes. The legends they preserve of hidden gold are many. The Indians especially are supposed to hold secrets which they hand down from generation to generation, of the shrines and treasures of their lost gods. As cupidity is not a vice of the pure-blood Indian, this seems always conceivable. You can find out nothing by asking Indians questions. Their innocent mirthfulness under cross-examination has always been one of the most baffling matters to the Spaniard. The days of burning them alive to find their secrets has of course long passed, but the Indians told little under the stress of pain. Over the slow fire, their innocent mirth changed to a suffering taciturnity and that unearthly fixed gaze which showed a race that had conquered pain. Out in this valley, most of the people now are pure-blood Indians, either Zapotecs or Mixtecs, unambitious, easygoing, fruitful, and true to the soil on which they have always lived. They were never an imperial race like the Aztecs, nor revengeful like the Totonacs. They have no inheritance of ill will, and all seem as happy as kings. Oaxaca today, despite the turmoil of the revolution, presents a picture of what Mexico as a whole might be if her people possessed the right temperament. For my part, I count the 3 weeks I spent in the Marquesate as the happiest in Mexico. One could easily become content to live a long while there. The people retain their national customs and are marvelously good-humored. Crime is rare, pistols infrequent, and the cost of living is less than half that of the capital. You can live very well on $2 a day. And the winter climate is perfect. The happiness of the little city is greatly enhanced by a large city square where a fine brass band plays every evening amid palms and electric lights and lilies and hanging rosy pomegranates. The cathedral faces the Palacio, and colored stone porticos of shops face porticos of other shops. The broad efflorescent square or plaza is in between. The cathedral, alas, looks like a ruin and has been taken and retaken by soldiers in many fights. The church is too poor to repair it. I saw the hombre mosca, the human fly, climb its pretty facade one morning, stepping on the carved saints and patting the infant Christ in St. Christopher's arms on his way up, and the church was quite impotent to stop the insult, even on a Sunday when Mass was observed within. A curious contrast, surely, a whole congregation on its knees listening to the sermons of an archbishop within, a hilarious crowd outside cheering the human fly and the brass band playing lustily. Something of the destiny of Mexico in all that. But in my opinion, the human flies hold the future. Sitting on the top of the cross on the turret of the cathedral, an American acrobat called Babe White unfurls a flag on which is printed, "Drink Montezuma beer." Poor old Pope, dead and gone, Holy Inquisition, what think you of that? The Palacio, where I saw the governor, Garcia Vigil, just before he left for Mexico City, where he was badly shot by a hired assassin, is a fine building, rendered more impressive by its Indian sentries, some of whom are extremely handsome and fine-looking soldiers. The legislative business of the state is transacted in this Palacio, and it occupies the whole of one side of the square. Here one may commonly see in the evenings and on Saturday morning long lines of Indians waiting for wages. On Saturday mornings, the band enters the interior square of the Palacio and plays while waiting for its pay. The shops, which flank the other two sides, exhibit various novedades in dress and many marvelous hats ranging in price from $10 to $100. As Mexicans are more proud of their headwear than of any other part of their attire, they are ready to pay fantastic prices for hats. These sombreros, which are usually of felt or velour, are sometimes 2 feet high and 3 feet across from rim to rim. When a little dark man puts on one of these, he changes in aspect and looks like some sort of fantastic magician. In front of the shops, and yet under the covered way of the porticos, are many tables and booths, and at the tables men wearing these sombreros and the long black mustachios play dominoes and drink beer. At the booths, quiet-eyed women sell cigarettes and sweets, and all along the curb outside the colored arches of the porticos sit Indian women with their hair hanging to the pavement, breasts exposed, and papooses sucking there. The scene in the plaza at nightfall, when the whole population comes out in parade, is in its way a ballet, unrehearsed and yet faultless. The life of the whole seems to be in the band up in the fine stand in the central circle of that square. There stands the perfect little Zapotec conductor facing another Indian who, with gourds in his hands, waves his rattle with long arms, and on each side of them and around them is resounding brass. A fine discipline has been achieved and a military precision in play. German and Spanish compositions alternate. Marches and Spanish dances seem to have a preference, and with joyous clamor and seductive melodies take possession of every man, woman, and child in the plaza. Most remarkable are the tatterdemalion crowds of Indians who, in cotton slops and bits of old blanket tied together, tramp into town and creep out of the dirt and the dust to the inner court of the bandstand. There they crouch and stare, though they get their music in ear-breaking blasts, being far too close, but they love to hear, in the midst of it, the rattle of the gourd players, the rattle of the raindrops, as in their own half-forgotten rituals. Huddled together, they stare at the brass, at the gourds, at the Zapotec bandmaster in his perfectly ironed regimentals. From the inner court of the bandstand go 6 shady tracks under palms and scarlet flowering trees and orange fruits dripping from boughs, and pomegranate trees, and these tracks reach the broad outer court, round which, like mystic shapes, the great crowd comes and goes. Here run the newsboys crying, "Patria, Patria," and the boys with dozens of bottles on their little heads shouting, "Frescos, Frescos," and scores of bootblacks with little wooden stools calling to all and sundry, "Grasar, Grasar." Here walk stately ice cream merchants with colored barrels balanced on their heads, and swarthy, sunburned men with sheaves of blankets for sale. Every Indian wears a blanket either slit at the middle for his head to go through, or swathed about his body from head to foot, as the Arab wears his burnous. Scarlet and orange are the commonest colors of these blankets. They wear their sombreros, the poor ones of straw, the rich ones of felt, Popocatépetls of felt, high-domed, vastly brimmed, embroidered. Here are gray hats, all decorated with sailing ships and anchors worked in brown silk. Here are white hats, bedizened with silver tinsel, sewn on as the Indian women sew beetlebacks and butterfly wings into their embroideries in India. The great hats flock, they shadow the pavement, and all the while Tran-Tan-Tan above it dominates the band. Little boys carrying sugar canes 8 feet long, all hung with tiny flags, add great color to the scene. The canes are perforated with tiny holes, and in each hole is a sugar plum mounted on a long match or wire, and each sugar plum has a tiny flag hanging from it. A dozen boys are carrying these resplendent poles. Several others are carrying gourds perforated and adorned in the same way. There are park seats all the way around, and there sit the more leisurely of the listeners and the tired, and watch the world go by. Old dames with trays of pineapple and girls with baskets of pine kernels go from seat to seat selling their wares. The Zapotec women are as straight as pine trees. They wear voluminous cotton skirts, but their feet are bare. Above the waist, they do not mind how much of their bodies they expose. They wear, commonly, a slightly embroidered cotton vest cut as low as the rise of their bosoms and leaving their arms bare from just below the shoulders. They have broad, open faces, carved mouths, lined brows, and an enormous flow of raven hair almost to their knees, which they allow to hang. They wear earrings of filigree gold and beautiful gold chains around their bare necks. They may be on the point of beggary and yet wear these. The young ones are very beautiful, but quiet-eyed and never lascivious. They hold their heads so far back that if they wore hairpins and dropped one, it would always fall clear of their bodies. Outside the Palacio, the sentries march to and fro, with bayonets fixed in loaded rifles. The sergeant of the guard has golden bobinets hanging from 6 golden chevrons. At the changing of the guard, bugles sound within the palace yard in a sort of counterblast to the triumphant choruses of the brass coming from the branches of the palm trees and the electric lights of the bandstand. Oaxaca birthplace of Diaz, birthplace of Juarez, is proud of itself and makes some show under the Mexican sky. Round and round walks the crowd, and there mingle with the Indians American men and women, jaunty men dressed anyhow, and women in low-cut evening gowns, simpering to one another and to their male companions. Mexican belles also come out with highly painted faces and dainty manicured hands. Girls in their teens join one another, and all holding arms walk in strings of 7s and 8s. Youths of similar age walk in similar strings. Horsemen with tight trousers and silver spurs dismount and tie up their steeds and join the throng. The governor himself, the legislature of the state, joins the parade. There is the highest and also the lowest. Bow, bow, bow come the beggars. You give them centavos or you give them cakes. They wear old dusty sombreros of straw, and you put the cakes on the brim. You see beggars with dozens of cakes and tortillas and rolls in the brims of their straw sombreros. The blind beggars walk in tandems, blind mother led by seeing child, sister by sister, grandfather by grandson. There are 2 pseudo-beggars, too proud actually to beg, and they get more alms than all the rest. One is a magnificent fellow with a gigantic straw sombrero. He has lost both legs at the knee, but he must have been very handsome. He has large pads now, like the wooden boots put on horses drawing the heavy roller over a lawn, and on these pads he walks like any other man, using hip muscles where we use the muscles of the knee. His yellow hat points backwards from his head. He carries a boot-black stool, and wherever he goes, the crowd makes way for him, a king of the pavement and of all beggars and boot-blacks. The other pseudo-beggar is a boy with a curved spine and a twisted body. He walks on all fours, and has a basket of matches or sweets hung from his neck. All among the people he jumps like a frog, and whose heart can be so hard as to refuse him when he looks up with angel smile so sweetly, so appealingly? You pretend to buy. He looks at what you give him meditatively. He looks up at you smiling, but perhaps a little troubled in expression. Adios? He asks, as if it were a question. Adios, you reply. The trouble clears from his face. He is perfectly happy. Adios, adios, he exclaims, and hops on like a frog amid the bare brown feet of the Indians and the polished boots of Mexicans and Americans. Tran, tan, tan goes the band all the while, and the Zapotec bandmaster, with narrowed waist and rigid little head and shoulders, looks like Juarez himself. And the rattle of the gourds is like the tambourines struck on the knees of the dancing girls. 8. Under the Great Tree of Tule. The greatest tree in the Americas, though not the highest, is in the far south of Mexico at Tula, some 10 miles from Oaxaca. The highest, and perhaps the oldest, is to be found among the California sequoias, but in girth and grandeur the cypress of Our Lady of Tula has no rival. The Aztecs called it the Ahuehuetl, but it was a fine old tree at the dawn of their history. It must have been a great tree in the time of the Toltecs, and was before them, too. Perhaps some emperor planted it 2,000 years ago. Who can say? Cortes and his horsemen, on their way to Honduras, stood under it 4 centuries ago, and their followers built a chapel there beside it, that men might fitly turn from a marvelous creation to a marvelous creator. It is a pleasant ride from the city in the early hours of the morning. The Zapotecs found us horses, with hooded stirrups and corded bridles, and my wife and I rode out to Tula. It was market day in the city, and we threaded our way through innumerable Indians and droves of asses laden with panniers. The astonishment of the Indian women at seeing a lady in riding attire was very amusing. They, for their part, pick up their long, flounced cotton skirts and sit with their bare feet balanced on the ass's shoulders. Flanked by baskets and sitting on heaps of merchandise on the ass's back, so they ride to market, often suckling a baby the while. But one of their sex astride? Good Saint Anne! Jesus Maria! Look, sister! Adios! Their conventions were not our conventions. They carried pigs strung by the legs to the ass's sides and dangling turkeys and fowls. They brought pots innumerable and baskets of eggs and tomatoes and alligator pears. Some Indians on foot plunged through the dust, and waddling all across the broad highway, the asses came on in droves. When we had ridden out of this turmoil into the fresher air, we were in a land of wild mimosa and that smell of wattle of which Kipling has written memorable words, "The smell of the wattle at Lichtenberg, riding in the rain." But there is no rain in Mexico all the winter long, and all odors that come on the air are warm. Trees with scarlet flowers bend over us. The pomegranate hangs its rosy fruit, the coffee berries ripen on the shrubs, and trees that know no fall, no nakedness of limb, hang everlasting canopies of green. We ride gaily over plowed cornfields and along the borders of plantations where sugar canes chatter with the wind. Then, anon towards noon, we descry a settlement veiled in verdure, and like a green knoll rising above it, the vast upper story of a mighty tree. There is no need to ask. It must be Thule in its tree. There we ride by narrow shady lanes between banana palms, date palms, and flowering shrubs, crisscross from the highway to the tree. Behold a great cliff of wood, gray like a willow or an ash, with an underbark of nut fiber color, growing upward in grand sweep to the branches. At the 5 bays of the tree one might build 5 fair-sized houses. All is silent, all is beautiful around it. A beggar only is sitting under the tree. The large white church behind it reflects a blaze of sunshine. A bougainvillea, 20 feet high, is one mass of crimson bloom, all attended by bees and wasps. The solid white wall, which runs round with blockhouse at one corner, is unimpaired. On the white facade of the high broad church are painted tall Moorish decorations in an intense royal blue, tall slender mosques of gleaming blue, and big red empty niches for the saints beside them. The tree lifts its voluminous green bulk higher than the church, but all of its branches, all its stems and leaves, hang as it were in reverence to the high-placed figure of the Virgin. It is plume-leaved, and the tree is held sacred by many tribes as the tree of mourning. It has the grand dignity of sorrow for the dead. What a tree! 100 horses could stand under it. Halfway up in the midst of the giant growth, starts straight and bolt upright a new tree, larger itself than any King Charles oak, larger even than that tree in Palestine under which the Greek monks tell you Abraham and Sarah entertained their Lord. The German Baron Humboldt, famous traveler in his day, scratched his name on it in the year 1802, the only name, the only vandalism which has been permitted. It is a perfect tree in full maturity, the same species of cypress as the tree of the dreadful night at Mexico City, but in incomparably better condition and much larger and older. If it could tell its story, the lingering of Cortes and his men in its shade would be but a page, for it must ever have attracted the attention of whoever passed that way. The old cities, like Mitla, 20 miles away, are choked in dust, but with the freshness of spring, the tree lives on. Outside the walled churchyard which holds the tree is the town plaza, swarming with wasps, but without garden or bandstand or any of the common adornments of such places, not even a statue of Juarez. But there is an old portal and one shut shop bearing the curious name of La Vuelta al Mundo, the return of the world. But they have all gone their way, those who sat under the tree in ages past, and none returned to tell us how it was in their day. So we to our horses once more, leaving, like the others, the tree behind like old time itself. 9. From the ruins of Mitla. Mitla is the American Luxor, and in the quieter days of Diaz's rule in Mexico, many were the travelers who went there to gaze and wonder. The ruins are those of some great city of a bygone civilization. But what civilization? Whose civilization? None can tell. History does not work for them as for the ruins of ancient Athens or Thebes, for they are entirely without record, and their story, whatever it may be, interweaves in no way with the story of mankind as we know it. How rash the outline of history seems when we look at the broken outlines of what is called Mitla. and the biblical traditions can hardly be felt to have any reference to Mitla either, unless, as some archaeologists have believed, the country was originally settled by one of the lost tribes of Israel. The greater part of the North American continent is without ruins, unless one thinks of the evidences of primitive man living there for ages. The mounds on the high banks of the Mississippi and the cliff dwellings of New Mexico tell not of a romantic past, but of the uncouth savagery of the Stone Age. But away south, in the latitude of what is now British Honduras, are evidences of a way of living not unlike that of the Greeks and Romans or the Egyptians. In fact, the dumbfounding truth is that the ruins are of a convincing resemblance to the ruins of the East. Whoever lived there prized gold and gems, as did humanity in the Old World, and there is evidence enough that they lived for empire and did as Persians and Babylonians. But they also built as humanity built in ages past, in Egypt in the East. The ruins of Mitla would not be supremely remarkable in the vicinity of Athens or Tyre or on the Nile. They would be almost in place. It is not merely because of the pyramids. The principal site of pyramids in Mexico is 200 and more miles to the north, and though of course one is tempted to link the Mexican pyramids with those of Egypt, the likeness is less startling than at first appears. It is common in peoples to imitate in their architecture the natural contours of their surroundings, and I think the Mexican pyramids, with their truncated tops, are imitations in stone of the altar-like pyramidal mountains, the little mesas so characteristic of the Anahuac Plateau. First, victims were offered for sacrifice on sacred mountains, and then, as a stage of progress, on stone piles shaped like mountains. But Mitla, and again Palenque in a similar latitude 250 miles east, are not imitations of anything in nature, but rather triumphs over ordinary life in vast untamed wildernesses. Their buildings have tradition and style. Whoever lived at Mitla lived sumptuously there. I traveled to the little mining town of Tlacolula, where the high road hastens downward toward Tehuantepec in the Pacific, and then took horses from the Zapotecs. Here all the inhabitants are either Zapotecs or Mixtec Indians, and I spent a dusty day at Mitla. Riding up a strange valley betwixt cavernous rock walls marked by splurges of ancient color, I thought of an immemorial road and slaves with pots on their heads and princes in chariots drawn by men. I thought of wars, invasions, and the massacre and destruction in what must have been the last days of that Mitla Empire, when some barbarous race, which cared not for art, swept in upon the people and destroyed them. There is a Zapotec village now. There were kings of Zapotec when Cortes came, and he made nothing of their kingship, though the greatest ruler that the Mexican people now acknowledge was a Zapotec, the famous and beloved President Benito Juarez. Behind the village, scorched and sun-bleached, lie heaps of what was empire, of what was ancient wreckage in the days when the Spaniards came. Some of it lies in shapeless ruin, perhaps the homes of the poor. Zapotec houses of adobe have added to the heaps. There were Zapotec buildings which the Spaniards sacked. There were tombs of Zapotec kings or the mummies of kings, stored with gold and gems in the ancient vaults of stone. Mitla figured for long in the quest for El Dorado, and still today it is believed by the Indians that vast sacred treasures are here stored away. They guard the place with superstitious horror still, and a grand work of excavation leading to the discovery of subterranean temples and mausoleums might credibly lead to an uprising. But I stood there undisturbed and looked at the great monoliths and halls, and the stamps of classic pillars, the great walls with their conventional carvings and crosses. I went underground into an atmosphere hot and close as the interior of a pyramid, into mysterious chambers. I crept, candle in hand, into an abyss of darkness, as it were into the hidden past of the dead, and with relief I returned to the tropic blaze of light outside. There stand long, low white walls with fretted battlements, and there are hieroglyphics which tell no story, and there in the dust lie the footmarks of barefooted Indians. What does it all mean? Who has the book of the words? There is no answer. I write my name in a register which an Indian workman keeps. Year 1923, nationality British. I came and I passed. I have a signature, but Mitla has none. That is not even its name. But fitly, one might read, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. 10. Ad Astra. The story of gold commences in Genesis, when of a certain country we are told, the gold of that land is good. It does not say for what or for whom it was good. It was just good. Gold is good. That was in the beginning. Primitive man held gold in his hand as children do bright pebbles, and he was pleased with it, as God the Creator himself was reputed to be pleased with the world when he had made it. Man in the earliest days kept the gold which he picked up, made a possession of it, fought to keep it, fought also to get other men's gold, or he stole it and was sued at law for its return. He burnished his gold, he cut it, he melted it, he cast it as personal adornment, he recast it as idols, he saw that fire has no power to destroy it, he put its power above the power of the sun, he worshipped it. No animal prizes gold, not even the ape. Desire for it is a human passion. After gold, the greatest possession was in brides, who were bought and sold for a weight of gold somewhat less than their own weight of flesh. And after men's wives, their cattle were most precious, and sold also for gold. Primitive man worshipped the idea of the perfect bride in a goddess of gold, and he worshipped his herds in the golden calf and golden bulls. Judah's gods were largely gold and sex. Moses gave, however, their vital revelation. His creative spirit distilled the idea of Jehovah, invisible lawgiver and controller, set above all visible creation. Still, the weakness of the Israelites has remained until this day, a passion for sex and gold. Gold in itself has nothing of evil in it. It is as innocent as iron or tin. If we call gold fine and lead base, it is because we ascribe to them our human ideas about them. Gold at best was prized for its beauty and its scarcity. It could fittingly adorn a bride, it could fittingly be devoted to Jehovah, as in the building of the temple, but once it had been used to make a golden calf, it had been defouled and could not be worn again or devoted to the true God. Moses made the children of Israel eat that disgraced gold, after the calf which they made of their Egyptian spoils had been consumed by fire. It is, however, possible that much of the gold of the Egyptians is worn and used by men and women today. Gold does not easily perish, and yet is not easily recognizable. It exists from age to age, cast and recast in ever new forms, gilding ever new superstitions, glories, and ambitions. The gold of Darius was the gold of Alexander, and the gold of Alexander was gold in the triumphs of the Romans. In turn, it adorned the rude limbs of Huns and Goths and Franks and Saracens. It glittered in the field of the cloth of gold. It was part of the treasure of the popes, but why labor the point? Gold has not been allowed to disappear. Tombs are rifled for it. Ocean's bottom is dredged for it. Every man who digs the soil is ready to identify it. The gold of the New World proved a marvelous accession and drew men to it more than did the cross of our religion. The wise men fixed their eyes on the East, seeking to lay aside their pride and bow to the spiritual new birth. But the young men of our era set their eyes on the West, saying, "Gold, we will go there for gold." And the older men looked there also, asking for power, of which gold is the index. Ah, it has been and is the great desideratum, gold, pockets full, coffers full, bank full, heart full, to be finished with the practical problem of life and to have at our disposal all that gold can command. With their gold, the rich gild temples as of old, forgetting the lesson that our God preferreth above all temples to the upright heart and pure. The cynics and the buffoons and the rabble make also their golden calves, which in turn some spiritual Moses will cast down. But where is the poetry of the quest of El Dorado? Surely, always in the quest and never in the attainment. If ever in life you find what you are seeking, you have gone wrong. Finding, you lose. The whole of life is balanced betwixt the aching heart and the golden dream. When the quest is transmuted to music, which, at its highest, strives to express the inexpressible, the ineffable, the unqualified X of life, gold is represented in deep notes and remote superterrestrial harmonies, suggesting a golden age, a golden dream, all that we have missed, the pathos of mortality, the forever lost, the infinitely precious past. There were beautiful women, myriads of them, each distinct and lovely in far-off other times, centuries, ages ago. Queens of Sheba, Helens, they sleep like the daughter of Pharaoh beside a lotus flower gone to dust, going to dust, to infinite fineness. Your eyes never saw them. They lifted their faces in the morning at sunrise in the valleys or on the mountains, far away in other times. We look back to them from the afternoon, from the evening, from a later time. We cannot see them. They are hidden forever like the heart of the world. Seek and ye shall find means seek forever and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened means knock forever and it shall be opened. How can we in our mortality find the gold? We cannot. The true Eldoradoist, hammer in hand, is knocking and tapping forever, seeking veins of gold, seeking hollow chambers, seeking and opening tombs, climbing westward after a vision which forsakes him every day of his life. But whither have we led our thoughts? Into what starlit unreality? This volume, the like of which was no doubt burned at Alexandria thousands of years ago, is a study of reality, is it not? The study of the quest of an everlasting substance by those who cannot last. It concerns largely the last 5 centuries of the second millennium after Christ, and certain peoples called Spanish, Indian, Anglo-Saxon. The Spanish people obtained a great hold on the gold, but it has fallen from their grasp. Americans now are foremost on the track of El Dorado, a super race who seek gold, it is true, but seek more the power of which gold is the index. They will take gold by machinery, power giving gold and gold giving power. They have seen in the mirage a golden dream and called it Pan America. There, most fittingly, closes this volume of the study of the quest of El Dorado. A thought, however, comes to me while looking at the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan. When America has consolidated Pan America from Alaska to Panama, she may build a great imperial memorial, a pyramid greater than all the other pyramids, a massive work of stone on which time can play but little havoc, and ultimately that pyramid alone will survive her. In the long night of history it will stand, in the starlit unreality of forgotten time. Others, somewhere afar, will be seeking still. The end. The end of chapter 25. End of In Quest of El Dorado by Stephen Graham.